Yo, what is up, guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully, you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So, Teofimo Lopez successfully makes his debut at £140 by defeating Pedro Campa by a 7th round stoppage in their 10-round fight. Now, of course, Teofimo Lopez going into this fight was coming off a loss to George Kambosos Jr. So there were some question marks over Teofimo Lopez. How would he look at the new weight? Was he still suffering from mental after effects following the Kambosos defeat? You know, there was a few question marks going into this fight. And ultimately, considering the level of opponent, because Pedro Campa isn't a world beater by any means, but I felt Teofimo Lopez actually looked pretty decent in this fight, all things considered. One thing that struck me right away was how strong Teo looked at 140, and what I mean by that is just his body. His body looked more full, he looked more healthy, looked more filled out. You know, he was a massive lightweight, Teofimo Lopez, and it makes you wonder how he made lightweight for so long, because even in this fight, he looked really, really broad, really big for 140, but, you know, it suited him, you know. And yeah, I felt he was also going into this fight, I think there were question marks over Teofimo Lopez's stamina, or at least how he manages his stamina. If you go back and watch the Kambosos fight, he basically blew his load in the first 2 rounds, whereas also in the Lomachenko fight, he kind of finished that fight in quite a subdued fashion, you know, lost the majority of rounds after round 7. So people have also been questioning his stamina, but in this Pedro Campa fight, one thing I noticed was that I felt that Teofimo wasn't wasting quite as many shots, he wasn't being as speculative with his combinations and things of that nature. I felt he was picking some really good single shots at times, and when the combinations were there, he would throw them. He wouldn't, you know, try to force them per se, and he wouldn't just try to blast Campa out of there. Instead, he slowly dissected him, he slowly broke him down, and eventually stopped him in the 7th round. Right from the very first bell, I felt Teo looked quick, he looked relatively dynamic in terms of offense and countering, and, you know, he was countering very effectively. He took advantage of Pedro Campa's low lead hand. Every time he jabbed, he'll bring it back low, and Teo was coming around the side with a looping right hand, and he was finding the chin of Pedro Campa. That was a shot that worked for him throughout this bout, and he was taking advantage of Pedro Campa's square-on style. We was talking about that leading into this fight, that Pedro Campa was very square-on. He attacks in straight lines. As I said, square on, head over his front foot. He's there to get countered with straight shots, uppercuts through the middle, and we saw that in this fight. Teo was able to counter Pedro Campa at will. Campa landed some shots here and there on Teofimo Lopez, but they didn't really faze Lopez, to be honest. He kind of, you know, shrugged them off and got on with it, which was good to see. One thing I will say, that Pedro Campa in this fight wasn't attacking with the same sort of intensity that he did in the fights that I saw prior. I know they were at a much lower level. Maybe he was, you know, kind of put aback by Teo's power, and that made him more circumspect, but he wasn't attacking with as much ferocity as I'd seen in his previous fights. But again, maybe he was put in his place by the power of Teofimo Lopez. But, you know, he showed a pretty good chin, Pedro Campa. He took some big shots coming in, but eventually those shots added up, and, you know, it got to the point where he took too many, and round 7, he walks into like a check left hook from Teofimo Lopez. Really good counter shot, drops him to the seat of his pants. He gets up and beats the count, but Teo jumps all over him, opens up with a combination. Some shots landed, some shots didn't. You know, Pedro Campa was definitely rocked, he was definitely buzzed, his nose was leaking, and the referee jumps in to wave it off. Could the referee have allowed this to continue? I think so, to be honest. I think so. I felt the stoppage was a little too early, quite frankly. But Teofimo was the guy who was in charge in this fight. He was landing the eye-catching shots, he was landing the hard shots, and in particular, that looping right hand around the low lead hand of Pedro Campa was working a treat for him throughout this fight. But ultimately, I felt Teo looked pretty good. Again, you have to consider the level of opponents here, but he did what he needed to do against that level of opponent, right? So, you know, all in all, considering the layoff, considering coming off a loss, Teo looked decent. He's now campaigning at 140. One thing I will say, he definitely looks more healthy at 140 in terms of his body. He looks more filled out. He looks strong. Seems to be still powerful at 140. So we'll see what he does next. Apparently he's coming back on the 10th of December at Madison Square Garden. Now the rumours are that he will fight Arnold Barboza. Now Arnold Barboza is a much different proposition to Pedro Campa. Barboza is a really versatile boxer, pretty big himself. He can box, he can move, he can brawl, he can fight on the inside, he's got a high output. He's a good fighter, Arnold Barboza, so that would be a big test for Teo at 140. And if he were to beat a guy like Barboza at 140, then Teo would definitely be a factor in the weight class. But yeah, I mean, all in all, a pretty good performance by Teo. We'll see what he does next. Share your thoughts below. Peace.